and how to slow or reverse the effects of aging by focusing on the cellular and molecular pathways that exist in all cells of the body and that progress those cells over time from young cells to old cells.
Andrew Huberman, a renowned neuroscientist, shed light on how our neural circuitry influences various aspects of our lives, including our diet and overall appearance.
All of us can slow or reverse the effects of aging. What is unique about his work is that it focuses on behavioral interventions, nutritional interventions, as well as supplementation and prescription drug interventions that can help us all age more slowly and reverse the effects of aging in all tissues of the body. It is not the normal and natural consequence that we all will suffer, but rather that aging is a disease that can be slowed or halted.
When he asked Dr. David Sinclair why elevated glucose and insulin age us more quickly.
Well, so longevity is the more academic way we describe what we research. Anti-aging is kind of the same thing, but it's got a bad rap because it's been used by a whole bunch of people that don't know what they're talking about. So I really don't like that term anti-aging. But aging as a disease and longevity are perfectly valid ways to talk about this subject. So let's talk about aging as a disease. When I started my research, disease here at Harvard Medical School, it was considered, if there's something that's wrong with you, and it's a rare thing, has to be less than 50% of the population, that's definitely a disease. And then people work their whole lives to try and cure that condition. And so I looked up what's the definition of aging, and it says, well, it's a deterioration in health and sickness, and you can die from it. Typically you do. So I'm thinking that sounds pretty much like a disease. Aging is 80 to 90% the cause of heart disease, Alzheimer's. If we didn't get old and our bodies stayed youthful, we would not get those diseases. And actually what we're showing in my lab is if you turn the clock back in tissues, those diseases go away. So aging is the problem. And instead, through most of the last 200 years, we've been sticking Band-Aids on diseases that have already occurred because of aging, and then it's too late. So there are a couple of things. One is we want to slow aging down so we don't get those diseases. And when they do occur, don't just stick a Band-Aid on, reverse the age of the body, and then the diseases will go away. And I actually ended up boiling aging down to an equation, which is the loss of information due to entropy. It's a hard thing to overcome the second law of thermodynamics, that's fair. But this equation really represents the fact that I think aging is a loss of information in the same way that when you Xerox something 1,000 times, you'll lose that information, or you try to copy a cassette tape, or even if you send information across the internet, some of it will get lost. That's what I think is aging. And there are two types of information in the body. There is the genetic information, which is digital, A, T, C, G, the chemical letters of DNA. But there's this other part of the information in the body that's just as important. It's essential, in fact, and that's the systems that control which genes are switched on and off, in what cell, at what time, in response to what we eat, etc. And it turns out that 80% of our future longevity and health is controlled by this second part, the epigenetic information, the control systems. I liken the DNA to the music that's on a DVD or a compact disc. For the younger people, we used to use these things.
I recall.
Yeah. And then the epigenome is the reader that says, okay, in this cell, we need to play that set of songs. And in this other cell, we have to play a different set of songs. But over time, aging is the equivalent of scratching the CD and the DVD so that you're not playing the right songs. And cells, when they don't hear the right songs, they get messed up and they don't function well. And that is what I'm saying is the main driver of aging. And these other hallmarks are largely manifestations of that process. The epigenome can change. Those loops and structures can be modified by how you live your life. And so if you're born tall, and I wasn't, and I wished at the time I did grow, but no matter what size you are, you can have a bigger impact on your life than anything your genes give you. 80% is epigenetic, not genetic.
So let's talk about some of the things that people can do. And I've kind of batched these into categories rather than just diving right into actionable protocols. So the first one relates to food, blood sugar, insulin. This is something I hear a lot about, that fasting is good for us, but rarely do I hear why it's good for us.
He said that modern society is the worst thing.
Well, let's start with what I think was a big mistake, was the idea that people should never be hungry, we live in a world now where there's at least 3 meals a day. And then we've got companies selling bars and snacks in between. So the feeling of hunger, some people never experience hunger in their whole lives. It's really, really bad for them. It was based, I believe, on the 20th century view that you don't want to stress out the pancreas. And you try to keep insulin levels pretty steady and not have this fluctuation. What we actually found, my colleagues and I, across this field of longevity, is that when you look at, first of all, animals, whether it's a dog or a mouse or a monkey, the ones that live the longest, by far, 30% longer, and stay healthy, are the ones that don't eat all the time. Actually, it was first discovered back in the early 20th century, but people ignored it. And then it was rediscovered in the 1930s. Clive McKay did caloric restriction. He put cellulose in the food of rats so they couldn't get as many calories even though they ate. And those rats lived 30% longer. But then it went away, and then it came back in the 2000s in a big way when a couple of things happened. One is that my lab and others showed that there are longevity genes in the body that come on and protect us from aging and disease. The group of genes that I work on are called sirtuins. There's 7 of them. And we showed in 2005 in a science paper that if you have low levels of insulin and another molecule called insulin-like growth factor, those low levels turn on the longevity genes. One of them that's really important is called SIRT1. But by having high levels of insulin all day, being fed means your longevity genes are not switched on. So you're falling apart. Your epigenome, your information that keeps your cells functioning over time just degrades quicker. Your clock is ticking faster by always being fed. Okay. The other thing that I think might be happening by always having food around is that it's not allowing the cell to have periods of rest and reestablish the epigenome. And so it also is accelerating in that direction.
Hunger, of course, is associated with low blood glucose and low insulin. Do you think there's anything about the subjective experience of hunger itself that could be beneficial for longevity?
Yeah, I do. Though you get used to the feeling of not eating. So I'm kind of screwed that way.
It's like cold water. You eventually adapt.
You get used to it, unfortunately. But there are some studies that are being done at the National Institutes of Health that are able to simulate the effect of hunger, but still provide the calories. And it's looking like there's a small component that's due to hunger. But most of it actually is because you've got these periods of not being fed, and then the body turns on these defensive genes. There's a really interesting experiment that was published maybe a couple of years ago by Rafael De Cabo down at the NIH. What he did was he took over 10,000 mice and gave them different combinations of fat, carbohydrate, protein, and he was trying to figure out what was the best combination. And then he also cleverly had two groups, one that was fed all the time, or ate as much as they wanted, and the other group was only given food for an hour a day. And it turns out they ate roughly the same amount of calories, because of course in an hour they're stuffing their faces. It turns out it didn't matter what diet he gave them, it was only the group that ate within that window that lived longer and dramatically longer. So my conclusion is, and mice are very similar to us metabolically, I think that tells us that it's not as important what you eat, it's when you eat during the day.
Or maybe I should just ask you, what is your protocol for when to eat and when to avoid food? Do you fast? Do you ever fast longer than 24 hours? What do you do? And what do you think is a good jumping off place if people want to explore this as a protocol?
Well, if there's one thing I could say, I would say definitely try to skip a meal a day. That's the best thing.
Does it matter which meal, or are they essentially equivalent?
Well, as long as it's at the end or the beginning of the day, because then you add that to the sleep period where you're hopefully not eating.
I think that's an excellent point. I realize it's a simple one, but I think it's an excellent one because I think one of the things that people struggle with the most is knowing when and how to initiate this so-called intermittent fasting. And the middle of the day obviously is not tacked to the sleep cycle in the same way. So it's much harder as well for many people.